Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another PBALC Literacy Speaking live stream. Today, we are so excited to welcome author Mikki Brammer. I hope I'm saying your last name correctly. Author of the Collected Regrets of Clover. We're so happy to have you today. Let's get right into it because we're running a little late this morning, or this afternoon, but love to be able to get right into it and start talking about your book.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, how about starting off by introducing yourself and telling our viewers a little bit about yourself?
So my name's Mikki. I am Australian. I'm from Tasmania, which, for those of you who don't know, is the island at the bottom of Australia. And I've lived in New York for 12 years. And before that, I was in Paris and also Barcelona. So it's been a while since I've lived in Australia. And I'm a journalist by trade. I mostly write about design and architecture and art. And this was my first book. And I actually hadn't planned to write a book until this idea came to me. So it was a surprise to everybody, including me.
It's a very interesting concept for sure. What inspired you to become a writer? To go from, I know you have journalism background, but what inspired you to become a published author?
An author. I think one of the reasons why I never really thought about it before this was because I didn't really feel like I had a story to tell that, that needed to be put out into the world. And then a kind of maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I went through this kind of journey of exploring. Ever since I was a little kid, I'd had a fear of death, and I really wanted to get curious about that. And so I live in New York City, and so you can really immerse yourself in anything. And I challenged myself, instead of avoiding the topic, which I usually did, I'd try to get more curious about it. And so I started going to talks about mortality, by hospice doctors and things like that, lectures on stoicism and all sorts of things, just so I could learn more about it. And that's when I learned about the profession of a death doula, which I'd never heard of. And I just found it so fascinating, but it also struck me as such a noble profession, someone dedicating their professional life to basically watching people die. And I couldn't imagine doing that, especially as someone who had a fear of death. And so then I thought, well, who would choose that? And that's when the character of Clover came to mind. And I thought, oh, that would make a really interesting story. And then I wondered if I could write a novel that dealt with all these topics, but in a way that was fun and uplifting and hopeful and not depressing, so that people like me who wouldn't normally read that kind of book could read it and kind of have access to these themes. So that's how it came about.
And so how did you develop your characters, or where did the ideas from these characters come from? I've heard other authors say, I have this friend that I base this character off, or I know this person that I met in a cafe that I base this character off. So where did you get your ideas for your characters?
Yeah, I really love people. I just find them so interesting. I love meeting new people. And because I've lived in a lot of places, I've met a lot of people. And I would say I'm quite observant and really like to see the different ways people are. And I've also worked freelance in New York City for a decade. And so that means you're often in a lot of different workplaces, working with a lot of people. And the thing that really struck me both about here, but also, Paris and Barcelona, is that these are really big cities with millions of people, and yet there's so many lonely people. So we live in each other's pockets, but we can't find a way to connect. And that was really interesting to me. And I'd met a lot of people, especially in New York, who society might have classed them as a loner, but they were actually very warm and interesting and emotionally intelligent people once you got to know them. And I thought, oh, isn't that interesting that, society puts them in this box, but that's not really how they are, but they're kind of stuck in this box once they're there. And so I really wanted to explore that. So I wouldn't say that anybody is based on any one person, but it's an amalgamation, a combination different people. And there are a lot of elderly characters in the book. I think 4 of the main characters are at least 80. And part of that came from I was raised by a single mother, but my brother and I, but we come from a very big extended family. And so we had a lot of grandparents and great aunts and uncles who really stepped in to help raise us. So I've always been around those people and found them to be so wise, and they set such great examples for me and shared their wisdom. And since then, I've also done a lot of volunteering with the elderly as well. And it makes me sad the way society tends to put old people away, you know, and see them as not having much value, when really they have so much value and wisdom because they've lived entire lives and they have things to share with us, but they don't often get that opportunity. So I wanted to kind of flip that a little bit in this book.
And it's so interesting because, you know, I tend to always find friends that are older people. and I don't know why. It's just that I find them so interesting. And they sometimes gravitate to me, and I know I have a brother that's similar too. A lot of older people just gravitate to him. I think because he has patience. He has a lot of patience and is willing to sit there and listen to them and their stories. And another thing about you talking about categorizing people as loners, or there's a lot of lonely people out there, and then they're not necessarily loners. They just, you know, as you get older, there's research out there that says it's harder to make friends. And so I think, especially after COVID, people were struggling to find connections and make connections and find friends, and you know, making friends is harder as you get older too. So it's not necessarily that you want to be a loner. It's just like it's a struggle to find friends.
Exactly. And that was really important for me to show, because I think in books often when there's a loner character, you know, they're portrayed as this grumpy misanthrope who hates people. And I don't think that's the case with most people who are lonely or isolated. It's just they've gotten into this situation. And as you say, as you get older, it's very hard to get yourself out of it, especially when the world sees you that way.
Yes. I just that cartoon, was it Up, where that grumpy old man he befriends
exactly. Exactly.
that
But
Boy
really he made
Scout,
a connection in
and
the
he's not really grumpy, he's not
end.
really a loner, he's just, you know, just kind of keeps to himself after his wife passed away. So you know, coming back to the death doula and death, what why do you think people find it difficult to discuss death? Because the a death doula seems similar to me as somebody that works in hospice, and I have a little bit of experience working in the hospice. And when I started working in hospice, it completely changed the way I thought about death. And so, but people still find it very difficult to discuss death. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think that's something that's very specific to Western society. I think other cultures are much better about it than we are. Australia is very similar to the United States. And my theory on that is that, you know, talking about death makes us face our own mortality. And that's not something we really want to do because it's very scary. And so that's why we don't talk about it, and it's become taboo, and we don't talk about it until it's too late to really do anything. And then that makes the whole process of either dying yourself or losing someone even harder. And so, I mean, I know because I avoided talking about it for the majority of my life. But now that, you know, a good way to get over that fear is to write a book, because then you're talking about death all the time. But what I realized,
you're researching it and just,
but
you know, writing about it.
Also, now from doing events and, you know, readings and people coming up to me, I realize that actually everybody wants to talk about it, but it's either because in our society it's very frowned upon to bring that up at dinner or something like that. But really, people like the opportunity to talk about it, and you can talk about it in ways that are more open and positive. And that's what I was hoping this book would do, would give people the chance to have those conversations with their loved ones, because the sooner you start talking about it, it's never going to be easy at the end, but it's going to make it a lot easier.
Mm-hmm. And I agree with you. I think it's very culturally too, because Mexican culture, it's just frowned upon to talk about death. Even talking about preparing wills
Yeah.
is so, it's frowned upon, because they're like, you're talking about, me dying, and you want me to write a will because you just want me to die. And it's like,
Yeah.
no, it's not that. It's just, me being prepared
Yeah. And I actually
for
think,
things, and
yeah.
it's culturally too, I think. um
And being
Discussion
prepared,
of death.
being prepared and doing those things, making sure you have your will or your last wishes and things like that, that's actually
Hmm.
an act of love for the people left behind, because you're making what's going to be a very hard time for them anyway
Hmm.
much easier, because they know what you
Right.
wanted, they know what your wishes are. But if they have to search through your stuff to find things and don't know where anything
But
is,
it's hard for them to get past the thought. I'm like, oh, you just want me to write the will because you just want me to
right,
die,
yeah,
and it's like, I don't want to die, and so they can't get past the death
yes,
discussion, I guess.
right, yeah,
And I think, in my opinion, sometimes it's difficult for people to talk about death because they feel like maybe they haven't lived their life to the fullest, and
hmm
the thought of, dying, it's like, oh, I haven't lived life to the fullest. I have so much more to live. I don't want to die. And so they
hmm
just don't want to, um they don't want to talk about it.
yeah,
Do
that's
you
true.
see that as well too?
Yeah, and I think that's something that I really tried to illustrate through the focus on regrets in the book, is that,
Hmm.
when I was researching it, I learned when I looked at the most common regrets people have at the end, they were really simple ones. It wasn't anything big like wish I had become a movie star, or I wish I played
uh,
in the NBA. It was just, I wish I hadn't worked as much. I wish I'd told people I loved
mm,
them more. I wish I'd learned Italian. I wish I'd tried watercolor painting. And all these things are things that were very doable for them, but because they didn't stop to look at what their regrets were until the very end when it was too late, then that's what makes it so sad. And what I hope that the book encourages people to do is to now say, well, if tomorrow were my last day, what would be my regret? And then maybe if you can take some small steps to resolving those, then great. And I think
mhm.
in that way, regrets can be a positive thing, because that's how we learn and grow. And I think if you've lived a life without regret, then you probably haven't lived a very interesting life, because, it's part of being human. But the point is to not ignore them until it's too late.
Yeah, yeah. And so, what kind of other research did you do for the book?
So I looked into the regrets in people's last words,
Hmm.
things like that. And that's how I learned that they often fall into the categories of advice, confessions, and regrets, which are the three
Mm.
notebooks that Clover has in her apartment. And then I spoke to some death doulas. I have a lot of family members who are doctors and nurses. So I spoke to them
Mhm.
about what their experiences were with people who were at the end of their lives. And
Mm.
that's there's a part in the book where close to the beginning, where Clover talks about the smell when someone's about to die, which my
Yes,
mum told me. My mum's a nurse, and she said that's
hospice
a thing.
nurses did.
Yeah. And I
Yes,
was like,
yes.
what? But what does it smell like? And she couldn't describe it. She's like, you just know. And so
Hmm.
I think I described it as when you're between autumn or no, at the end of summer and the beginning of fall, when something's changed but you can't describe it, because I think it is
Uh-huh.
but just things like that were so interesting. And I read that people often talk about going on a trip when they're about to die, which I found so
Uh-huh.
interesting. And I asked a death doula, well, what do you say when people say that? And she's like, I just offer to help them pack, and because they are going on a journey. And I
Yeah.
really loved that, so I included that in the book. So I read a lot of books about it. I listened to a lot of podcasts and really just did as much as I could. And then what I learned is that there's many different ways of being a death doula. And so some people are more medical and others are more experiential, and some deal with more the logistics of things. So I kind of thought about everything and then thought about if I were a death doula, how I would approach it. And that's kind of what Clover became.
And so tell me a little bit more about death doula, because to me, it sounds very similar to like a hospice
It
nurse
is,
or something like
yeah.
that. But why did these people decide to pursue a career in this field?
From what I gather from a lot of people I spoke to, often it's because they've nursed a loved one,
Okay.
or been with a loved one at the end of their lives, and realize that they have a not a talent, but it's something that they're good at, and
Skill.
it feels very much like a calling, similar to Clover in the book. And the thing is, like, the term death doula is very new, but it has existed for thousands of years or forever. There
Mm-hmm.
are hospice workers, there are, doctors, nurses, priests, nuns, spiritual, like lots of different people have always performed this
I
capacity.
know
But
in the Native American culture, there is something similar to that as well.
right,
Yeah.
yeah. And so I think it's just more, this term has emerged, also end of life doula, which is great because I think most people like me didn't know it existed, but it
Uh-huh.
is a great thing to happen because when I was writing this, it was during COVID, and it really made me realize how many people would have been dying alone during that time in
Mm-hmm.
isolation, and how important it is to have someone, if you don't have any friends or family, to have this person with you. And unfortunately, a lot of them do it volunteer, or they're not paid very much, which for something that's so emotionally taxing and,
Mm-hmm.
such an important profession, that's a shame. But I feel like that's a theme of our world. The most important professions like teachers and nurses and death doulas are not paid
Yeah.
as well as they
Unfortunately.
should be, which is a shame. But I think the more people become aware of them, hopefully there'll be more support
And
financially for them.
and death doula and hospice workers, because hospice is a whole team. It's like you'll have
Mm-hmm.
a nurse, a volunteer, a pastor, everything else. It brings so much um, relief to
Yes,
the family.
exactly.
Hmm.
And I
And
think that's there as
help them
much.
out because you if a person, they may have family members that can take care of them, but may not be isolated. But the family is having a hard time with the death
Mm-hmm.
too, and so
Yeah.
bringing in a death doula or a hospice team can alleviate their grief and their stress so
Mm.
much. And I saw
Yeah.
that working in hospice.
That's a really good point. I think often the death doula is as much for the family and the people left
Mhm.
behind as it is for the person who's at the end of their life.
Absolutely. And so, what do you hope is the biggest takeaway that you want your readers to take from this story?
Um, I would say, aside from making it easier to talk about, I would
Uh-huh.
really hope that it inspires people to kind of, in the book, one of the characters says to Clover that, she's dedicated her life to giving people a beautiful death. But the
Mhm.
secret to being able to have a beautiful death is having lived a beautiful life. And so I
That's
would hope that people would stop and ask themselves, if tomorrow, well, when my time finally comes, what would it mean to be able to say that I lived a beautiful life? And then what's one step that I could take tomorrow that would get me closer to that?
amazing. Well, can you read a selection for our viewers?
Sure, I'll read the first chapter. Um, and so the book, most of it takes place when Clover is 36, but there are also flashbacks to when she was a kid, and this is one of them. The first time I watched someone die, I was 5. Mr. Hyland, my kindergarten teacher, was a cheerful, tubby man whose shiny scalp and perfectly round face reminded me of the moon. One afternoon, my classmates and I sat cross-legged on the scratchy carpet in front of him, enthralled by his theatrical telling of Peter Rabbit. I remember how his meaty thighs spilled over the edges of the child-sized wooden chair he sat on. His cheeks were rosier than usual, but who could blame him for getting excited over a good Beatrix Potter plot? As the story reached its climax, when Peter Rabbit lost his jacket fleeing the evil Mr. McGregor, Mr. Hyland stopped, as if pausing for emphasis. We stared up at him, hearts thumping with anticipation. But instead of resuming his narration, he made a sound similar to a hiccup, eyes bulging. Then, like a felled redwood tree, he toppled to the ground. We all sat motionless, wide-eyed, unsure if our beloved teacher was just upping the ante on his usual dramatic storytelling. When he hadn't moved after several minutes, not even to blink his open eyes, the room erupted with squeals of panic from everyone. Everyone except for me, that is. I moved closer to Mr. Hyland to hear the final push of air from his lungs. As the pandemonium echoed down the hall and the other teachers rushed into the classroom, I sat beside him, holding his hand calmly as the last blush of red disappeared from his face. The school recommended I get counselling following the incident, but my parents, who were more than a little self-absorbed, noted no significant change in my behaviour. They bought me an ice cream, patted me on the head, and, reasoning that I'd always been slightly odd, judged me to be fine. Mostly I was fine, but I've wondered ever since what Mr. Hyland would have liked his last words to be if they hadn't been about the antics of a particularly naughty rabbit.
What I love about the book too is that it's there's humor in it. So
Yes.
it's like, oh, you're thinking about death, you're talking about death and dying, but there's humor in it. So it's like death doesn't always have to be gloomy and
Yeah, that's what I tried to do, like even in the sadder moments, put the humor in there to make it a little bit more digestible.
I was in the background just laughing about her description of the gentleman that
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, face like a moon. All right.
That was actually based on my 4th grade teacher. He looked like that.
Oh boy. So there you do have certain people in your life.
Oh yeah, that's true. Physically, he looked like that.
So what other projects and books are you currently working on, or is this you're trying to get to this one right now?
Yeah, I'm putting the final touches on my next book, which I think would be out next summer. And it is, I would say, similar existential themes, much less death, but a similar mix of, thoughtful kind of life-affirming things, but also keeping it fun and hopeful as well.
Hopeful. Light and hopeful.
Yeah.
We all need that right now, right? So where can people get information about your books and purchase your books?
Yes, so on my website you can sign up for my newsletter, and I think the direct link is like mikkibrammer.com/newsletter, but it's also in my Instagram bio, and I will probably in the next few weeks or so will announce the new book and when it's coming out and what it is and things like that. So
we're excited about that. Hopefully we can feature you next year with your new book.
That would be great.
Well, and we always share the links to the author's sites. So
wonderful.
Comments afterwards. And lastly, because we love reading, we think reading and writing is an integral part of literacy here at the Literacy Center. What are you currently reading, and can you give our followers and viewers some recommendations?
Yes, I'm currently reading The Emperor of Gladness by Ocean Vuong, which just came out a couple of weeks ago, and I'm really enjoying that. And another recent favorite was Martyr by Kaveh Akbar. And I also liked James by Percival Everett, and The Names by Florence Knapp that came out. That's a really, well, I wouldn't say fun because it does deal with domestic violence, but it's a very interesting concept, and it's about what a child, and it shows the different course of his life based on what name he was given, and it's a really interesting concept. But it also explores domestic violence and things like that. It's a very clever approach. I really admire, from a literary perspective, I really admired the way she approached that. And then a book I really loved from the past couple of years is Shark Heart, which no one ever understands when I say it in Australian. So it's Shark Heart, and it's by Emily Habeck, I think you say it. Okay. And that's really interesting too, because it's a very creative. There's a little bit of magical realism in there, but it deals kind of with similar themes to my book. And I think she just did an amazing job. And it also has a really beautiful cover.
Awesome. Well, your cover is very pretty too.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I really like it.
You know, sometimes you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but
right.
You know,
but how can you not?
I'm always attracted to covers. You know, pretty covers. Well, I enjoyed your book, and I hope our viewers and followers will check it out as well. We'll share the links, like I said, on the bookshop, and it can be purchased at any independent bookshop. We really thrive to promote independent bookshops, but they can also be purchased on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or any of your local bookshops.
Or at the library, hopefully you can borrow it.
Yes, absolutely. We tend to forget about the library, but yes, libraries are always available to purchase books or to check out books. Again, I want to thank you, Mikki, for joining us this afternoon, and make sure and check her out on social media, her website, and her books, like I said, are available everywhere books are sold. So make sure and purchase her book. And I want to thank everybody for watching, and thank again, Mikki, for joining us. And
thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everybody for listening. I know it's the middle of the day and you're very busy, so the fact that you would take the time to listen really means a lot to me. And if you do read my book, I really appreciate that too, because there's so many wonderful books out there. So
make sure and give her a shout out and tell her that you saw her on Literacy Speaking.
Yes, I would love to hear that.
Well, thank you everyone for watching, and we will see everyone next time.
Thank you. Thanks, Alba.
Thank you. Bye.